and welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Lyndal. The Prime Minister has returned from her holidays and is taking up the fight on one of the issues troubling the government, electricity prices. She's spreading the blame for rising power bills, saying there's a regulatory incentive to overinvest in the transmission network and state governments are taking a larger slice of the pie. But why now? In April last year, when Roscano identified the problem of overinvestment, or gold-plating the network as he called it, the Energy Minister dismissed him, saying he didn't speak for the government. To discuss the issues of the day, I've been joined by Labor MP Michelle Rowland and Liberal MP Steve Ciobo. Welcome to you both. We'll hear first from Julia Gillard, who's asking the states for help to reduce power bills, pushing for work decided on at the last COAG meeting to be done by the end of the year. She says she wants cooperation, but is willing to use a stick if the carrot doesn't work.
For too long, some state governments have been increasing their revenue at the expense of the family electricity bill. That has to stop. I want real decisions this year to guide price determinations beginning next year. My preference is to work cooperatively with the states through COAG to deliver a better outcome for consumers. We won't lightly use the big stick of regulation of stronger powers for the energy regulator and the ACCC, but it's a stick we hold and which we will use if required.
Michelle, the Prime Minister had that report from Roscano in April last year. There was another report from the energy regulator at the end of last year, both of which talked about overinvestment in the transmission network. Why is the Prime Minister taking up this issue now? Is it just because the state Labor governments who had control of the system for so long are no longer in place?
I think it's been building up for some time, actually, Lyndal, and it's come to a head now because we are at a state where the levels of increases, 50% in some cases over 4 years in consumer electricity prices, 70% in the case of New South Wales, it has come to a point where I think we've realised it's unsustainable. The Prime Minister said some really interesting things, I think, in this speech. I think the emphasis on the future and the emphasis on COAG needing to cooperate, and she said herself that following on from the recent COAG meetings, she sees this as a really important catalyst to actually make this happen and make reform happen. The Productivity Commission did say that one area where gains would specifically be made in a competition and regulatory sense would be in energy market reform. It is simply unsustainable to be going in the situation we have where you've got generation costs, distribution and transmission costs, which far and above exceed what consumers are able to pay because it is simply a pass-through. It's a pass-through to consumers in the end. And I think what the public has known for a very long time is that whilst I know the opposition is going around linking all this to the price that's been put on carbon, people know that it's been building up for something like 4 or 5 years. And it has come to a head now, and I'm actually, as a former competition regulatory lawyer myself, I find it very interesting and also refreshing that her focus is on saying, well, look, we're going to look at where the market's failed. If it fails anymore, we're going to have to step in, recognising that it's a national market, recognising that there needs to be cooperation with the states. But prudent and efficient investment should be absolutely paramount. We've had some cases of enormous dividends being increased, $169 million in January, an increase in the dividends. Again, that's a pass-through that goes straight on to consumers.
Steve Ciobo, if I could bring you in, Isn't the Prime Minister choosing the right time now because she's got the support of the states and territories who at the last COAG meeting agreed to have energy ministers look at this issue?
You know, Lyndal, I think if there's one thing I'd say about this Prime Minister, it's that if you tell enough lies, you obviously get used to telling them. I need not really remind people that this is the Prime Minister who said there'd be no carbon tax under her government 6 days out from the last election.
But
now,
where's the line now?
Well, I'll tell you, we have a complete bold-faced hypocrisy from this Prime Minister who stares at the people of Australia in the eye and says, enough is enough when it comes to electricity prices. I'm going to get tough on electricity prices. I mean, please spare us all. Julia Gillard and her government has done more to push up the price of electricity in the past 6 months than anything the state governments have done. And I find it absurd in the extreme through the introduction of the carbon tax, Lyndal.
Steve, sorry, Michelle. Steve, if I could interject there, haven't electricity prices been going up by a lot more than 10% over a number of years, and hasn't it been state governments allowing that overinvestment in the transmission networks, and state governments taking the dividends from that?
But Lyndal, I think there's an important point to notice from this, and I'll talk about Queensland because that's the state I know best. I mean, we had up until about 3 months ago a Labor government that for all intents and purposes had been in power in this state of Queensland for 20 years. And they have absolutely destroyed cost of living. They have made it so expensive to live in Queensland. We've lost our AAA rating, and we went from being the lowest tax state to now being mid-tier. So there's no doubt at all, and I agree wholeheartedly with you, that the state Labor government in Queensland did an appalling job. But what we're talking about now, Lyndal, is building on top of all of those price increases that we've seen, is a great big whopping carbon tax, which has pushed up the price of electricity, and that is now cascading throughout the economy. Because as we know, electricity is pretty much an input into everything. And I just find it barefaced hypocrisy for the Prime Minister to stand up and act now as if she's so concerned about electricity prices when she clearly does not care. All she cares about is the politics of this, and she realises that there is a massive cost of living issue that her government has been ignoring, so she's radically attempting to deflect attention and say, oh, it's not the federal Labor government, it's all the state guys.
Michelle, if the states take less of a dividend from their electricity companies, they will have to replace the money from somewhere, don't they? It's not the states taking the money and stuffing it in their own pockets. They're actually spending it on their residents.
You would hope that, Lyndal, but the reality is that even in New South Wales, again, well, the state that I know best, obviously, it was actually a promise by Barry O'Farrell to put a freeze on dividends. But in January, the dividends for Ausgrid and Endeavour went up by $169 million. And that's the increase. That's in addition to the billions of dollars in their statements of corporate intent already, for which dividends are derived. I think that there's, to bring some intellectual rigour to the conversation, look, there is an argument about gold plating investment. And there is also a very legitimate argument about the fact that the electricity companies are required to ensure continuity of supply so that regardless of how much is actually consumed, you actually have to ensure that on the peak days, and again, that's only maybe a couple of days a year, maybe some of the hottest days of the year, we're going to hit peak demand. You have to build for that peak demand. Now, that doesn't sound incredibly smart in the long term, and I think the Prime Minister was saying something very positive in her speech also when she talked about the need for innovation. She said, how many homes have smart meters? How many homes are actually able to afford other forms of energy-saving devices? I think energy reform is an area where we can actually make a difference to the people that matter the most, the consumers, and quite frankly, people know, Steve, people know that their bills have been going up and up over the past 4 or 5 years.
So why have you made it worse? So why are you making it worse?
Well, I knew that line was coming. But the point is, the Prime Minister is seeking to make a real difference in the way that the energy market operates in Australia for the long term.
It's ridiculous,
Steve, if the Prime Minister, whatever her motives and whatever her reasons, can get cooperation from the states and a way to reduce power bills for consumers, isn't that a good thing?
Of course it is. I mean, of course it's a good thing. But you know, the issue is this: if the Prime Minister is genuinely concerned about cost of living, why has this Prime Minister put in place a carbon tax when she said she wouldn't? Why has this Prime Minister effectively gutted the Medicare safety net when she said she wouldn't do that? Why has this Prime Minister reduced the private health insurance rebate when they said they weren't going to touch it? You see, the issue is this: that on every single major issue that affects household budgets, I mean, in my own electorate, 55% of people had private medical insurance. This Prime Minister has, in some instances, just pushed their price up by 30 or 40%. You see, and it's not just confined to electricity, and that's why I think it's my position that I think Australians are tired of this Prime Minister and are tired of the barefaced hypocrisy when she, as I said, wrings her hands in earnest and claims that she's so concerned about the cost of living, but on every single measure is actually making the problem worse.
If we could move on to an issue where there will probably be equally little agreement, the report of the expert panel on asylum seekers is expected to be released next Monday in time for Parliament's return on Tuesday. The opposition's immigration spokesman Scott Morrison said today one of the recommendations that would make a difference is if the panel called for an election. Mr Morrison wants a regional focus to stay exactly where it is, on deterring people smuggling, not on regional protection, and he said the problem of people smuggling is one of secondary people movements.
Australia and Southeast Asia are not responsible for the world's refugee problems. We will do our bit, as we always have, especially in our part of the world. But we must resist the aspirational temptation to become the solution for somewhere else. Regional cooperation, though, will not be enough. It is not a silver bullet, as no single measure in this debate is. It is part of a solution, but it is not the solution. You must have a set of proven domestic deterrence policies that remove the sugar from the table, as the Indonesians like to describe it.
Steve, Scott Morrison also talked about the Coalition's policy of processing on Nauru. He also says those on temporary protection visas under the Coalition would be be returned home where necessary. Otherwise, they'd stay in the queue for potential permanent visas. Doesn't that leave people either in that queue or on Nauru without a time frame for when they might get permanent protection visas?
No, what it means, Lyndal, is that Australians can have confidence that if people are in a situation where they seek temporary protection because of circumstances in the country from where they've come, then we will provide them temporary protection. If, on the other hand, it's deemed that they are a genuine refugee and ought to be granted refugee status in Australia, then that applies to them. So, I don't think that does anything other than hold in good faith what the Australian people expect their government to do.
Michelle, the issue is likely to come back before Parliament with the expert panel report being released on Monday. Given what Scott Morrison has had to say today, can you see any way the Parliament will come to an agreement on this issue?
Well, Lyndal, I was an observer for the last round, and unless there is movement either by the Greens or the Coalition, personally I can't see a way through, and I can tell you, it was one of the most unedifying things to be an observer of, and I know that I speak for many of my constituents who say the same because they rang me up and told me. But I think the point about this expert panel, look, I thought it was a good idea. I thought it was a good idea for this reason, because in the corporate world, when you reach a deadlock and you think that there's no way through, often it is a really good idea to get an arbitrator in. And I thought that the people the Prime Minister had chosen and people she invited to be on it would generate respect, and also actually we could say that this would be an arbiter, someone who could come up with some sort of some new ideas, not be the person who actually makes the decision. That's of course is the matter for Parliament, but often it's very useful to open these things up. But I can't see personally. I can't see the Coalition moving on anything that it said, especially after what we've just heard here. So, look, the cards will fall as they will, Lyndal. We'll see what happens.
I'm sorry, that's where we'll have to leave it. We've run out of time. Michelle Rowland and Steve Ciobo, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining Capitol Hill. Please be with us tomorrow.